Have you ever wondered why Jesus says, look at the birds of the air when he's talking about anxiety and worry? I want to show you why he does this. This is really cool. This is Matthew chapter 6. We'll start in verse 25. This is another Bible study walkthrough where hopefully by the end of this, you'll know how to read and study the Bible better. Okay, when you read the Bible, read things in context. That's the first key here. This idea of the birds not sowing or reaping, it's a part of a greater point. It's an illustration, okay? Jesus is using the birds and the flowers, lilies of the field, as an illustration for his points about anxiety and worry. So if you struggle with anxiety and worry, verse 25, he says, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing?" Now this is where we get into look at the birds. Jesus is not just randomly saying, hey, look at the birds. Let me figure out some way to connect it to what I'm saying. He's already moving his audience to this illustration by setting them up with these thoughts, okay? He says, don't be anxious. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight in blue any main thought or main idea that relates to the illustration put forth in verse 26. Okay, and it's helpful to pay attention to this. When you read the Bible, sometimes you'll highlight different things for different reasons. Okay, in this case, I'm just using blue to highlight anything that I believe is a main point that relates to the illustration. Don't be anxious, okay? And he specifically says not to be anxious about these things: life, what you will eat, what you will drink, what you will put on your body, okay? And life, he'll repeat twice, is more than food, and the body is more than clothing. The reason I highlighted those specific words in that color is because they relate to the kind of anxieties of the audience, or the kind of worries and concerns that can flood the hearts of those who are listening in the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus says, what I should have backed up and said is this word therefore is connecting a previous thought to the conclusion he's come to here in verse 25. Jesus doesn't randomly say, therefore, don't be anxious. It's related to the main last thing he said, which we'll back it up a little bit. And this is when you read the Bible, look, I encourage you to backtrack if you have to. If you don't understand what you're reading, like here, verse 25, and there are a few questions you have, sometimes just backtrack a little bit, read the surrounding context, make sure you understand the main point of the previous passage, and you'll probably have your questions answered. If not, keep reading, and you'll probably get your questions answered. Okay, but either way, what I'm trying to say is don't just fly through a text. Make sense of it. So the last thing he said was, no one can serve two masters. You'll either be devoted to God or money, but you cannot serve both. So it's like, therefore, because you can't serve God and money, therefore. In other words, what he's about to say, what do you think it relates to? It relates to money. And it relates to what? Serving God. So because of that, when you read the Bible again, pay attention to words like therefore, because essentially Jesus is saying, we can conclude this because of what I just told you. Since you can't serve God and money, don't be anxious about life, food, drink, clothing, body, none of that, okay? So what I want to think about is, how does this passage here in verse 25 on relate to the fact that you can't serve God and money? What's the connection between money and serving God and what he's about to say? Well, let's think about it. Therefore, I tell you, don't be anxious about your life. And when you read the Bible, again, pay attention to repeating words. What I noticed here is that life and body are repeated twice. The concept of eating is also repeated twice, okay? And the main three things, this is why I highlighted this in the color that I did. Well, not the color, but here's why I highlighted these words, is because they relate to concerns. These are concerns of the audience. They're concerned or anxious. To be anxious is to be overly concerned to the point of obsessing and stressing and worrying. They're anxious about their life, okay? But they have decided in their minds that their life is very simply what they'll eat, drink, and put on the body. Those three things. In other words, food, drink, and clothing. Now ask yourself, how do you get food, drink, and clothing? Don't you need to have money? So what we should think about is, hey, he just said you can't serve God and money. And then he talks about not being worried about things that you can buy with money. Otherwise, what happens? If you start being anxious about these things and start to sum up your life and boil life down to just these basic physical needs, which are absolutely fundamental and essential for sure, but at the same time, when you make life only about these temporary physical needs, then what happens is you begin to look to money to solve those issues or those anxieties, which is why Jesus says you can't serve God and money, therefore don't be anxious. Because if you end up being anxious, you'll start to look more to money than you do to God, and you'll serve money instead of God, thinking that money will solve my problems. But do you know why you think like that? It's because you have taken life and the substance and the essence of life and boiled it down to just having your physical needs met. And you go, this is the sum total of my life, is just to have my physical needs met. No, that's a part of life. That's not the substance or the sum total of your life. And lots of people have reason to, legitimately have concerns about these things. But when you let those concerns go on too long and breed anxiety and worry, you begin to look to money as your God instead of God and trusting him. So now he says, look at the birds of the air. So you should have these ideas at the front of your mind as you read verse 26, that we shouldn't serve God in money, or we can't serve God in money. We should choose God over money. And I shouldn't be anxious about the temporary physical needs of my life. Those few ideas, I want to think about how they connect to verse 26, because Jesus goes right into it. Look at the birds of the air. Now, what I want to think about, and I'll probably highlight this in orange, okay, is what about the birds is he emphasizing? He's not just saying, look at the birds and figure it out. He'll tell you why to look at the birds. They don't what? They don't sow, which is to plant like a farmer. They don't reap, which is to gather in crops and harvest, right? They don't gather into barns. And this word, or phrase rather, and yet, technically just the word yet is what I want to focus in on. This is telling us, despite these things, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Meaning, you could read it like this: your heavenly Father feeds them, even though these birds don't plant, sow seed in the ground, are looking at the field, seeing if it's time to harvest and bring in the produce. They're not gathering into barns and storing for the winter and calculating and systematizing everything and strategizing, not structuring. Even though they don't do those things, your heavenly Father still feeds them. In other words, the birds become an illustration of God's tender care and provision for even the smallest of creatures that seem insignificant. Birds? Well, do birds put in work to actually get food? For sure. We're not saying they don't. Jesus is saying they're not doing all the strategic planning and calculating and balancing of the scales and planting and making sure the field's clear and then going and putting seed in. And even though they're not doing all of that, God still feeds them. Now let's think about that. What Jesus is emphasizing about the birds is not what they do, but what they don't do. And yet, what God still chooses to do, even though they don't do certain things. God feeds them. This is the point. So what we want to think about is, what is the main point of looking at the birds? The main point is that God is the one who feeds them. Okay? Even though they don't do all the different things that should, constitute being fed, God still feeds them. They go out, they find the food, they put the work in for sure, but they ain't planting, gathering, harvesting, sowing, and planting. God still feeds them though. So, are you not of more value than they? So if you're wondering, how does this relate to my anxiety and my needs and well, the fact is, God values you. That's what I highlighted in orange, because those are two things that God does. God values you, and God feeds the birds. In Luke, it'll say, aren't two birds sold for a penny, essentially? Like, Aren't they essentially like worthless? Very, very, very low value? And why does God care so tenderly for them and feed them? Aren't you of more value than they? So God does value people. That's something to think about when it comes to anxiety. For some reason, Jesus emphasizes the value you have, or God has assigned you by his grace. He values you. That seems to be the point, is if he values you, he'll take care of you, right? But when you forget that you're not, if you forget you're valued by God, you think you have to get yours and you have to take care of you and you got to feed yourself because you don't have a good God looking out for you. Then you start looking at money to take care of you. You stress about your needs. You can see how this can spiral out of control very fast. So this is why he brings in the birds, because two sparrows are sold for a penny. Why would God feed these insignificant creatures? Well, because he's demonstrating to you a spiritual principle, that God is the one who cares for his creation. It's not on you. Do birds still put in effort and responsibility? Yeah, so this is what I do when I read the Bible. I think about these things. I know you're probably going, where are you getting all this information? It's not in the text. Well, this is why we meditate on the scriptures and study and ask questions and think through things. Why look at the birds? Oh, Jesus is saying that the Father feeds them and that we have more value. So there's a connection between value and God feeding or caring for something. It means he values that creature. He values us more. There's a hierarchy of value, apparently. This is the question. Aren't you more valuable than they? Seems like a pretty clear answer. Yeah. And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? The answer is no one. You cannot decide to live any longer. You can't absolutely definitively make sure that tomorrow I will be alive. He's going to talk about how your span of life is in God's hands, just like your physical needs are. I can't add a single hour to my span of life, especially by being anxious. So there's another thing to consider that Jesus is connecting to the birds of the air, who are carefree, live their life, find food when they're hungry, right? And God feeds them. He's connecting the idea that you can't add or lengthen your life anymore. You can't definitively make sure you're going to live longer by stressing and being anxious. You can't do it. So therefore, anxiety doesn't add to your life. It actually takes away. Anxiety takes away and robs you of life. The birds aren't out there stressing, trying to add a single hour to their life because they can't. Anxiety robs us of life, true life, which Jesus will go on to explain as seeking first the kingdom. But that's how I would explain the birds of the air fit into this beautiful message on not being anxious and not serving money instead of God, is that the birds just go about their merry way. The birds are carefree. They do their thing. They put their effort in, and they essentially have to trust God with the results. Not that they're consciously doing so, but God is in charge of the results of their efforts. And he's the same towards us. So that's how the birds fit into this. You can keep reading, and we could spend a long time on this, but I just wanted to emphasize that sometimes when we're anxious and worried, we just need to look at creation a little bit longer and meditate on what God's doing in and through people around us, in the world around us, and in our own lives, in order to remember life is not just about the temporary physical concerns and needs in this world. Life is so much more. So don't think that life is the sum total of your existence is just about having your physical needs met. Don't think that you don't have value to God. Don't think your Father won't take care of you. He will. And at the end of this, Jesus will say, just seek first the kingdom, and all these things will be added to you. I encourage you guys to read the rest of this chapter on your own. Let me know in the comments how you learned anything and what stood out to you. And look, if you want to learn how to read the Bible, like really study the Bible and go in depth and do this kind of stuff, we have a completely free 40-day Bible study course. Again, that's free. It's online. It's self-paced. It's for people who are frustrated, bored, confused, don't know where to start, overwhelmed. If you also don't want to do the 40-day program, we have a 27-day and an 11-day program. It's self-paced, it's free, it's online, and I encourage you to check it out. Okay, go check that out at abovereproachministry.com, or in the description below. You'll see the link. And either way, I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough. Thanks for watching.